The Israel-Palestine conflict. We're seeing it in the news. But what's going on? Why did it happen? As of today, according to BBC, at least 122 people have been killed in Gaza and 8 have died in Israel since the fighting began on this past Monday. Israel's military said air and ground forces were involved in attacks on Friday, which is today, but they had not entered Gaza. Meanwhile, clashes between Palestinians and the Israeli security forces spread across much of the West Bank as well. Missiles are still streaking back and forth between Gaza and the cities across Israel, resulting in deadliest violence in years. Needless to say, the situation is escalating as opposed to calming down. But what ignited this violence this time? I'm going to talk to you about that today. And not go into the history, the century-old history of the Arab-Jewish conflict, which was intensified with the creation of Israel, because that'd be a topic for some other day. But I'm going to talk to you about what happened this past Monday for the situation to get so unstable again. But before I start listing the facts, though, I have to inform you that the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today is collected from multiple media sources who've been reporting on the recent most eruption of violence in the region. One of the main triggers for the current conflict is the forced eviction faced by 8 Palestinian families from the Jewish landlords in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Now, to go briefly into the history, when Palestinian families were displaced and made refugees in the 1948 war that led to the creation of the State of Israel, some of them moved into this area of East Jerusalem. At that time, in 1948, this neighborhood was under the control of the Jordanian government, who assured these Palestinian families, in conjunction with the UN Refugee Agency, that if they give up their refugee status, they'd get houses built for them in the neighborhood to live. And these houses would also be registered in the names of those Palestinian families. Of course, the Palestinian families agreed to that, but the registration of the houses in their names never happened. In the 1967 Middle East War, Jordan lost control of East Jerusalem and Israel occupied that territory. The world still considers that territory to be occupied territory. So because the houses in that region were not registered in the name of the Palestinians as agreed by Jordan, these Palestinian families who've lived there since 1948 are now living in the same houses, but the land that their houses were built on was in control of Jordan before 1967, but has been in control of Israel ever since. As of now, the rights to that land are with a Jewish real estate agency who wants to move Jews into that neighborhood that's predominantly Palestinian. This is in line with the 1970s law that was passed to allow Jewish property owners to reclaim property in East Jerusalem. But point to note, Palestinians who do not have the same right to reclaim their property that they left on the west side of Jerusalem or anywhere else in Israel. So these looming evictions came to represent a lot more than just a private real estate dispute that the Israeli government writes it off as. The dispute has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and the final verdict is to come soon. But because of the history and what this dispute represents, it grew to larger proportions to become a national issue. The spokesperson for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Rupert Colville, said that the evictions, if ordered and implemented, would violate Israel's obligation under international law. He added that East Jerusalem remains part of the occupied Palestinian territory in which international humanitarian law applies. He went on to say that the occupying power must respect and cannot confiscate property in occupied territory. In other words, he said that Israel cannot impose its own set of laws in occupied territory, including East Jerusalem, to evict Palestinians from their homes. So as this was happening in the background, this past month was also the month of Ramadan, a holy month in Islam. And this month also coincided with some dates in the Hebrew calendar that Israeli Jews celebrate, including the Jerusalem Day, which celebrates the reunification of Jerusalem in the 1967 war. So now you understand that this time is full of tension on both sides. Palestinians and Israelis. Add to that incidents like Israeli police not letting Palestinians to gather and break their fast at the Damascus Gate, as they traditionally do every year during Ramadan. This year, barriers were put up by the police and the crowds were forcefully dispersed. And there was also a TikTok video that went viral in which two Palestinian youth filmed themselves slapping an Orthodox Jew while he was sitting on a light rail. That led to protests by hundreds of Israeli youth through the Damascus Gate, chanting things like "death to Arabs." Every night at the Damascus Gate, there was unrest, there were clashes, and that also became one of the triggers leading up to this Monday. Now, coming to Monday. So, for Muslims, there's a special night in the month of Ramadan called Laylat al-Qadr, which falls roughly around the 27th night in Ramadan. Traditionally, thousands of Palestinian Muslims gather in the compound of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on that night and spend the night there in prayer. Al-Aqsa Mosque is a site of conflict for Arabs and Jews for a very long time. While it is the third holiest site in Islam, it is also the holiest place for Jews in the form of Temple Mount. On this day of Laylat al-Qadr, Israeli police raided the compound where Palestinians had gathered because, according to the authorities, there was an anticipation of a violent conflict between some Jewish groups going up to the Temple Mount and the Palestinian Muslims who were there, ready to retaliate with stones and violence. So the police said that they did what they did to end the violence. There are many stories and perspectives around that, but the fact is that the police raided the compound that night. They used tear gas, rubber bullets, stun grenades to disperse the crowds. 313 Palestinians were injured, 250 were treated in the hospital, and 21 police officers were also injured. After that police raid happens, Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic group based in Gaza that borders Israel, comes into action. Hamas sends an ultimatum that if by 6 p.m. that day Israel does not withdraw all its forces from the Al-Aqsa Mosque or from the areas of East Jerusalem where evictions were taking place, something would happen and Israel would pay the price. Obviously, the Israelis were not going to comply and the deadline passes. Hamas sent missiles into Israel. Now, Israel has technology called the Iron Dome that intercepts at least 90% of all the rockets that are headed from Hamas to Israel's populated areas. Because of the Iron Dome protection, the missiles that Hamas fire towards Israel do not cause any human loss. Some missiles fell in the empty grounds in the hills to the west of Jerusalem, and there was property damage, but nobody was killed or hurt that night. And then Israel responded too. It has a bank of targets in Gaza, and the airstrikes began on those targets. Children are dying. Civilians are dying. Something has to change. And that's the update on the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. We'll join you again for another community update. Until then, please take care.